Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. We're just setting up for what's going to be an amazing session, and Peter is again going to moderate for us. So as you know, because I've been telling you at every opportunity, the theme running through this conference, of course, is that we now face two determined adversaries. The old structures that we've worked with in foreign policy that have been comfortable for us for decades aren't necessarily working anymore, so we need to be a little bit more nimble and creative. Well, there's no better group to discuss these themes together than three distinguished former national security advisors, who I'm also lucky enough to call friends and who are wonderful human beings. So I'm going to embarrass you just a little bit. I think Steve Hadley said that his first job in government was during the Nixon administration, and I think, as you put it, Steve, it was like getting on the Titanic after it had already hit the iceberg. And he stayed to rebuild confidence in our national security establishment, and of course went on to do great, great things for the US government. Tom Donilon started during the Carter administration, when, as I pointed out at the very opening, we were struggling with inflation, a weak economy, a very expansionist Soviet Union with the invasion of Afghanistan. So a lot coming at us then too. And Condi, as she sometimes put it, cut her teeth at the NSC as a staffer at the end of the Cold War, the reunification of Germany. And I think, as you said it once, with seemingly everyone declaring democracy. And now that seems like an amazing part of our history, but it wasn't so certain that the Cold War was going to end peacefully. So this is just a reminder that this country has faced enormous challenges before. And through the really hard work and thoughtfulness and the innovation of people like Condi, Steve, and Tom, we've been able to get through it. So please come up to the stage. Thank you.
Just go ahead, go ahead. Just right next to Condi is fine. We want to separate these two. Okay, good. You're right next to me. All right, this is a high-power group here. I'm very glad to have all of these guys here. We're here to talk about the Denver Broncos and handicap the upcoming season, yes? Okay, all right, wrong panel, sorry. But Secretary Rice, congratulations on your new share of ownership in the Denver Broncos. We're wishing you well and wishing the team well here.
Go Broncos.
Should be an exciting new role. You have been involved in plenty of physical hits in a metaphorical political sense. Now it'll be fun to watch in your new ownership box. We're lucky to have with us today the 19th, 20th, and 22nd National Security Advisors, as well as the 66th Secretary of State. And cumulatively, these three have sat in that famous northwest corner office of the West Wing for more than 10 years. It's a lot of scar tissue to show for it, I think. But also a lot of wisdom, and we're lucky to have them with us today to talk about the world in general. And as we just finished up with Secretary Esper, we were discussing, I think, the broader picture right now, and I think that's where we'd like to start. It's an extraordinary moment, really, in the world today. We have the war in Europe, we have a reordering in the Middle East, we have a long-term challenge in Asia, as we just discussed. We had the rise of populist extremists, the fall of globalism, maybe, the climate change roasting Europe as we speak, and of course the pandemic that just won't let go. So how would you assess where we are right now? How would you assess America's role in the world right now? And I'll start with Secretary Rice.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot. Peter, you do a great job of reporting on these issues and informing the American public, and I'll start there. I think this is a time where we and those in office and those out of office have got to spend a lot of time talking to the American public about why a continued American role is important. We know that there are isolationist elements on both sides of the aisle. We know that that Americans carry kind of two simultaneous and contradictory thoughts in their minds. One is Haven't we done enough? Can't somebody else do it now? We ended the Cold War, unified Germany, defeated Al-Qaeda, let over to somebody else. And on the other hand, Americans, when they see a big country try to liquidate a small one, as we're seeing in Europe, or Syrian children choking on nerve gas, or people being beheaded on television, they say, no, that can't happen. So somehow, we've got to appeal to the side of Americans that say, okay, if not us, then who? And the reason that I think I start with that is that the long list of challenges that you outlined and the fact that there is such great uncertainty makes even more important the American role as a kind of anchor for a balance of power that favors freedom. Not just a balance of power, but a balance of power that actually is consistent with our values. And so I start with, can we sustain an American role in the world? Can whoever's in the White House count on not just the Congress, but the American people to be there? And we're gonna have a test of it. We'll get to this. We're gonna have a test of it in Ukraine, because this is not gonna be quick and over. It's going to require sustained effort, and I worry most when I think about it, can we sustain that effort? So I would start with educating the American people.
Well, Tom, I mean, that raises the question, is, a lot of people around the world would say this is an America in decline. Is that something you agree with? And if not, how do we show it?
Well, I disagree. I think if you did an analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the United States going into this century, I think the United States has every possibility of remaining the most important country in the world going forward. We can talk about that kind of assets and liabilities analysis. But to follow on Condi's point, it's a fraught moment. With combination of challenges, both internal and external, for the United States, I think. We've had now 2 major global crises in a little over 2 years: the COVID crisis, which is still having an impact, Peter, as you said, and the Ukraine crisis, which really is a crisis with global impact. And they very well be the 3rd and 4th crises of the very short 21st century, if you count the 9/11 and the great financial crisis. And it presents incredible challenges to the United States. I'm reminded, Connie, listening to you, of the need for a long-term commitment here, and reminded of JFK's, in his inaugural address, talking about a long twilight struggle. That is where we are. As a country, I think we're at the front end here of a long struggle. The challenges that you outlined, Peter, are not going to be solved at a conference next month or next year. It's going to require sustained, as Condi said, sustained effort by the United States, in a period which looks very different from the period that Anya described, that Steve and Condi oversaw at the end of the Cold War. Very different, and I think it's characterized, I'll finish on this, really by extraordinary fragmentation. During the post-Cold War period, we had, quite a bit of constructive and productive relationships and projects and work between and among the great powers. And that period is in the rearview mirror. And if you look at where we are today, I think one of the principal outcomes of the Ukraine crisis will be a long-term standoff between the West and Russia down the middle of Europe. I think that, number 2, that's exacerbated U.S.-China and Western China relations, I think, and has diminished them. You have a partnership developing between China and Russia, which I think is durable and for real. And you have a whole set of countries, we would have called them non-aligned countries in the Cold War, the global South today, who are in the middle, if you will, right? And over which there'll be a lot of competition, who will have to make choices and will take tremendous efforts by the United States on its diplomatic, economic, and military efforts to bring them on side, I think, in our efforts. So it's a fraught world, and I think with a tremendous amount of fragmentation and a dramatic change from the world that we had in the wake of the Cold War.
Yeah, I think in the White House, in your old offices, they refer to those non-aligned states now as swing states. That's actually the way they look at it. Okay. Steve, I mean, this fragmentation that Tom is talking about, how much does we talked about this with Secretary Esper a minute ago, how much does our crisis of democracy here at home hurt our credibility abroad? What do we do about that? It is a moment where we just can't seem to figure out our own business, so why would we be telling anybody else how to run theirs?
Well, 2 things. Question. Why is it fraught? It's fraught because we defeated fascism in World War II, defeated communism in the Cold War, emerged at the end of that period with a belief, and supported by where the rest of the world was, that our values of democracy, freedom, human rights were accepted as the paradigm for how you had a successful and prosperous state. And we built an international order based on those principles. And that is now at issue. We have the return of great power competition. We have a rise of new authoritarians. We have all the things we've talked about. It's a completely different world. What do we do about it? We can talk about all the foreign policy challenges. I think we can manage all of those with our friends and allies. We can't do it alone. We can with our friends and allies. But I would say one thing as a foreign policy person, it starts here at home. If we cannot establish a firm foundation here at home by fixing our politics so we actually can pass legislation to address our problems, get an economy going that is inclusive, that everybody benefits from, and restore the faith of the American people in our own democratic institutions, we will not be able to make the case to them for American leadership in the world, and we will not be able to make that case in the world because, quite frankly, the world, when they think about democracy, they think about the United States, and we don't look good right now. We need a brand refresh, and that starts by fixing our problems at home. So, as foreign policy folks, I think we would all say to you, it begins here at home.
Well, and we talk a lot about leadership in this moment. And, you look at President Biden, obviously, his approval numbers are low. They're almost Trump-like level. But he's not the only one. I mean, Mario Draghi is out. Boris Johnson is out. Naftali Bennett is out just in the last few days. In France, Macron is at a net negative 29 points. In Germany, Scholz is at a net negative 22 points. Trudeau in South Korea. What's going on? Do we have epically bad leaders right now? Or do we have an epically sour mood beyond just the United States, or is this, again, a larger crisis of democracy outside our, not just our own borders, but across the world as we have seen it?
I'm inclined to say that it's not just bad leaders, but they happen to be unfortunate enough to be leading in a time of great impatience about everything. If you think about, I teach in a university, and knowledge is fast food, right? With all due respect, you Google it if you want to know it. And I will tell you, my students think that if they've Googled it, they've studied it. And so, in fact, we're in an impatient time, and in democracies, people's impatience, their sense that their needs are not being met, immediately translate into, all right, it's the jerk that I elected, and I've got to do something about that. You know, we've had this a long time in the United States, though, and the day that we inaugurate a president, that's the most amazing human being God ever created, and a year later, it's how did we elect that bum? And so I think it's part of the nature of the modern society that people want results quickly, and when they can't get results quickly, they're unhappy about it. I'll say two other quick things, though, Peter. The other point that I'd make is that in some places we also aren't delivering. If you think about the human condition today, we can't have any more third graders who can't read. We can't have any more 18-year-olds who are about to go off and get a college degree that's going to be basically worthless with a lot of debt attached to it. We haven't paid enough attention to our human potential, and people understand that. If you're the unemployed coal miner in West Virginia, we can talk about the value of globalization till we're blue in the face. You don't feel it. And so we're not delivering. But I do have to say one other thing. Let's not get into authoritarian envy. Right? Because there is this tendency to say, oh, authoritarians, they build such great airports, you know? Their roads are always clean. Our former president had a little bit of this tendency. And I say, yeah, you know, that zero COVID policy, how's that working out? That one-child policy. Now 34 million Chinese men don't have mates. And oh, by the way, let's just, on the whims of somebody who thinks he's Peter the Great, launch a destructive war against your neighbor and try to liquidate. So let's not get authoritarian envy when we look at some of the failures of democracy.
Just three quick things. I think that's exactly right. You know, one is that these leaders come at a time, as I said, kind of in the wake of these two crises, which have been exhausting, frankly, and present leaders with very difficult challenges economically and in terms of society. So they're unlucky, I think, in terms of some of it. Second is there is deep polarization in democratic societies around the world. There's a lot of reason for that, right? Including technology, but there are other reasons as well, and they're subject to those cross pressures. On authoritarians, it's interesting. Condi, I agree totally with you. One other thing I think. Talks about the impact of COVID on democracies and the impact on these leaders and their approval ratings and their ability to get things done and the exhaustion in their societies. I think COVID has also had a negative impact with respect to diplomacy and the isolation of Putin and Xi Jinping. I agree. And you have Putin really seeing himself, right, as the embodiment of the Russian state, pretty much alone by himself for over 2 years, surrounded with people that both Steve and Condi and I know, who are really not the most forward-looking people in the world, right? Really surrounded by FSB and KGB characters. And if you think about what a KGB, FSB, senior successful person looks like in the late Soviet Empire, this is who's around him, right? Conspiratorial, anti-Western, right? Not very worldly. And so Putin does, I think, see himself as the embodiment, as I said, of the Russian state, and puts himself in the mind of thinking that he's a Peter the Great or something like that, and there's been no contact with him, right? I think Xi Jinping the same way. Now, China's not the same as Russia. There's a system in China by which decisions get made. But they have been very isolated and in kind of unprecedented ways if you look at the last 20 or 30 years. There's no feedback loop. So Xi Jinping himself and his system doesn't have the kind of interaction with the rest of the world. And I think that has negatively affected the quality of decision-making in Beijing as well as in Russia.
Steve, let's talk about Putin a little bit. Bill Burns told us just the other day that he is, quote, entirely too healthy, and that therefore the speculation that a lot of us had was, well, maybe he's sick, maybe something's going on there that's motivating him. Doesn't seem to be the case. So all three of you work for presidents who tried to get along with Russia. There was the Obama reset. There was President Bush and President Putin's friendship that he tried to stimulate. Is this the Putin you guys saw? Has he changed? Did we misjudge him in the past? Were we naive about him? Has he evolved or become more dangerous than we knew at the time? What is your take today, looking back with hindsight, about how we looked at Putin during your time in office and then after that?
Well, Connie will have some views on this. Look, I think there's this tendency to look at these people and think they sort of sprang fully formed at the day they came into office. Putin has been in office now for 20 years. He's learned a lot in that period. He's changed a lot in that period. I think we would say we started out trying to engage Putin, trying to incorporate Russia in international institutions. We actually made a lot of progress cooperating with Russia on a whole series of issues. I would say what was the problem was the color revolutions, which Putin decided were basically a CIA operation operating through NGOs to topple governments and put in place, we would say democratic, he would say democratic governments that were anti-Russian. And that it was a dress rehearsal for what we were going to do with Russia. And I think at that point, we lost him. And you then saw Georgia in 2008, where he invades Georgia to keep Georgia from moving west. And at the time, we said, if we can't invoke a major strategic cost on Putin, today it'll be Georgia, tomorrow it'll be Ukraine, and the day after it'll be Baltic states. And that's kind of where we are. So I think he's changed. But I also think he has now a vision of Russia as this restoration. It's a unique culture, and that he is going to restore not the Soviet Empire, but the Russian Empire. And that's really what Ukraine is all about. Because without Ukraine, Russia is a regional power at best. With Ukraine, it has pretensions for empire. And that's why this is so important an issue.
Secretary Rice, do you think he's the same? And if not, I mean, does that mean that there was something we could have done differently?
Well, he's more of who he was, I would put it that way. Let me just pick up on something that Steve said. I first met Vladimir Putin when he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And I remember thinking to myself, why would he be associated with a reformist mayor, Anatoly Sobchak? He was a Russian nationalist. And what you have to understand about Vladimir Putin is that, like maybe some others in the KGB, he actually blamed communism for the collapse of the Soviet Union and for the fact that there was an independent Ukraine. I mean, in his speech just before the invasion, he actually blamed Lenin for Ukraine. So it becomes about the Russian nation. He actually told me on several occasions, you know, Russia's only been great when it's been ruled by great men like Peter the Great and Alexander II. Well, now he actually thinks he's Peter the Great. So something did change, and I think that Tom is onto something. The isolation, hanging out with these kind of modern-day Rasputins like Kolvachuk, getting in his head that he had a dynastic, messianic duty to do these things. Could we have done anything differently? I will go out on a limb here and say that I think everybody from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration to the Obama administration to the Trump administration did everything possible to try to integrate Russia into the international system. The idea that somehow we tried to humiliate Russia, we tried to impose a kind of Versailles-like, it just isn't true. But at some point, you had to say, let's take the expansion of NATO, which is always on the table when we talk about this. You know, what you're really going to say to the newly democratic Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, ultimately later on Romania, the Baltic states, oh, sorry, you've gone through this democratic revolution, you've broken away from a Soviet Union that can no longer keep, but you're still part of the Soviet Empire, so just get used to it. And it turns out that the Poles and the Hungarians and others, who they would remind us when we were at NATO, that this wasn't actually about NATO's role in Afghanistan for them. They were in NATO because Russia would be revanchist one day. And so maybe they understood it better than we did. And if I'm glad we did one thing, I'm glad we included as many countries as possible in NATO's, within NATO, or we might have been talking about a very different world than just Ukraine.
Well, then, with that
Tom,
totally, by the way, yeah. on the NATO expansion point, it would be a very different Europe absent NATO expansion. And you think about where the barriers are with respect to what Putin might do, and it really is around Article 5 and NATO. And it was always from the beginning. I was deeply involved in the initial NATO expansion, as you know. And it was always from the beginning a hedge against a Russia pursuing imperialist or more aggressive goals. When's the last time, by the way, in terms of talking about Ukraine, that you heard Putin talk about NATO expansion?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not.
And by the way, not in the 8 years that we knew him.
Yeah.
This issue didn't come up with me or with Steve or with George W. Bush. Later on, missile defenses in NATO came up. But if he'd been so worried about NATO expansion, you would have thought he would have talked about it.
Very rarely discussed. In all my conversations going into the second Obama term with Putin, you know, quite directly, this was not really what was going on. Steve, I think, had it right. It was clear, I think, coming out of the color revolutions, coming into his second term, and out of the whole series of events in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, that in fact that he had decided that Russia was going to take a different and more unique role in the world, and that he was going to put a stake down and to resist kind of what he saw as the United States and Western pursuing its goals via these international operations. And at that point, I concluded and indicated to President Obama that he was no longer interested in integration. You remember, up until the Ukraine invasion in 2014, we had Russian soldiers at NATO headquarters, right? We had undertaken a major set of efforts to try to integrate Russia, both economically, militarily, and in other ways into the West. And he decided he wasn't interested in that. He was off on a different project, which I think was to build out the Russian Empire.
What do you think, did we hang on to that idea of integration too long? In other words, did we do enough after the 2008 Georgia war? Did we do enough after 2014 and the Crimea annexation? Did he take our responses to those events as not being all that painful to him, and therefore he could still continue to be aggressive?
I think we probably should have done more. Connie and I have had this discussion after Georgia. Should we have done economic sanctions, for example? Well, and then we reminded ourselves we were facing the greatest financial and economic downturn since the Great Depression. Not a great time to start imposing economic sanctions. But I think you can say we could have done more, probably should have done more. Would it have made a difference? I don't think so, because this is an idée fixe with Putin. And he's already shown, given the losses he has sustained, both on the military terms, but also economically, that he is wedded to this vision. He is all in this vision and is going to pay any price for it. And I think we have to take that seriously, and we have to take him seriously. And I was taken by an article, actually, by one of your colleagues at the New York Times, who said that this is Putin's three-part plan. One, he's going to take a big chunk of Donbass, as much as he can, and hold it. And he thinks over time the Ukrainians will kind of lose their will to fight. And at some point there will be a coup, and Zelensky will be out, and other figures within Ukraine will emerge, and they will make a peace with Russia that basically effectively brings Ukraine under Russia's sphere of influence. And then he thinks he'll be able to make up with the West, because he follows our politics, and he thinks that the trends of those in our societies, the populist trends, will at some point decide it is not worth it for the United States and Europe to pay so high a price in Ukraine, and they will make their peace with Russia. That's his vision. Yeah. And I think we have to take it seriously. And he's prepared to play the long game to get there. And his assumption is he can play the long game. He can hold his people behind that vision longer than we can hold our people into resisting it.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of challenges in that. You know, he made a fundamental misjudgment about the Ukrainian people, though, right? And I don't think he really understood that from 2014 on, there was quite a bit of resentment of Russia and Putin. If you had done a poll in Ukraine probably in 2011 or 2012, you would have found over 50% of the Ukrainian people having some positive opinions of Putin and Russia. And of course, that's now been destroyed. And it was destroyed over time from 2014 onward until the invasion of this past February 24th.
Well, Tom, so Steve just said that they should have done more after the 2008 Georgia war, even if it might not have had the impact that we would have liked it. Do you think that about 2014?
I think we probably should have. We could have done more to push back against Putin at that time. I think that's right. I don't know if it would have ultimately made a difference with respect to his ultimate goals, but I think that's a fair point.
I just want to say, though, one thing happened after 2014 that we're now seeing the results of. I have to say, I was surprised at how good the Ukrainian forces are. So whatever we started to do to train the Ukrainian forces after Crimea has started to pay off. I just wanted to make one point that's not a Putin point, but it's about Russia. One of the things that really concerns me is we could lose an entire generation of Russians in this standoff with Putin. You know, I was first in the Soviet Union as a graduate student in 1979. And Soviet citizens looked at their feet. They accepted whatever shoes green shoes in size 9 central planning spit out that year. They didn't travel. They didn't know anyone. And in the almost 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and if you add the Gorbachev period, this is a population that opened up to the world. I taught them in my graduate school of business classes at Stanford. They were in our law firms. They were in our banks. And there's a whole generation for whom opening up to the world was a great thing. And not just the intellectual elites. I mean, you know, modern or middle-class Russians spoiling their kids at Toys R Us and buying their furniture at IKEA. And for these city dwellers, Vladimir Putin is an anathema. But I worry that either this will to be more integrated as a people will simply be suppressed, which is what we're seeing, or they'll leave. And by many counts, as many as 600,000, 700,000 Russians have left. They are entrepreneurs, they are software engineers, they are educated people. And that would be a great tragedy because you can't isolate 150 million people forever. And I'm very worried about what happens to the Russian people.
That's what's going to happen during as long as Putin is there. You know, you will have this brain drain, no doubt about it. Think about this. If you were a technology worker, a knowledge worker in Russia, and you now look at your life going forward, completely cut off from the West and technology advancements and export controls on things that you want to work with. And indeed, as Connie said, the investment banks, the banks, the law firms, right, the consulting firms, the venture capital firms, right, you're now cut off. You have to start thinking, there's no future for you here, right, going forward. And I think that is what's going to happen. I think that he's damaged has damaged his people and the state pretty
Well,
dramatically.
let me ask this as a quiz then. Is there anybody on the stage who thinks that Vladimir Putin will not survive in power as a result?
I think he will die one day.
Are you sure?
Happens to everybody. Look, I will admit that at the beginning of this, I thought he would be done because this was such a destructive war and what would happen to his own country. I probably, as much as I know about the country, underestimated the ability to really crack down on dissent. But sooner or later, this will be a Russia that is not, that is no longer, can even begin to be thought of as a superpower. It will be a Russia that's not just isolated, but poor. And I would, there's never honor among thieves. And if I were Putin, I'd keep my eye on people like Patrushev.
What do you think, Steve?
One of the problems about this, and one of the great tragedies, is Putin is using the excuse of his war on Ukraine to crack down domestically in Russia. And it is on its way to becoming, again, a totalitarian society. And the thing about totalitarian rulers is they could insulate themselves from strategic mistakes. And I think we would say Putin, over the long term, has made a strategic mistake because he's mortgaging the future of his own country. And I would say that Xi Jinping has made two strategic mistakes for which he's not yet paid but will pay. One is he's killed the goose that laid the golden egg. He's taken an economy that was integrated into the world and that was growing in double digits, and by his intervention in the economy, attacks on some of the companies that were really driving that economy, injecting of the party back into all aspects of affairs, he has reduced that growth rate to single digits. And I think that's a huge price that he has paid. And secondly, by his more aggressive foreign policy, he's woken us all up about the challenge by China. You would have not heard the kind of conversations now about China 4 years ago, 5 years ago. But his own policies, by abandoning hide and bide, being more aggressive, has really woken up the world to the China challenge. These are two strategic mistakes, and the question is, when will the bill come due?
Yeah, one of the principal forces or assets behind U.S. diplomacy in Asia and around the world with respect to China has been China's conduct over the last couple of years. I agree with Steve also that the next year or so is a really critical time to watch in terms of China's future. Will Xi Jinping continue to pursue the statist economic policies that Steve described that he has pursued? Will he continue to disincentivize the private sector, which has been the core of the growth in China the last 20 years? Will they continue to become more isolated in terms of interaction with the world? And what decision will he make in the next 6 or 8 months with respect to COVID? Right now, of course, the last quarter's growth rate was 0.4%. I don't know how credible that is. I think it may probably negative. And at this point, is China going to be a 2 or 3% growth country, or anywhere near where it was before? So there are some fundamental decisions, Peter, I think, that Xi Jinping and China has to make in the next half a year to a year, which will really say a lot about the trajectory of that country.
Well, Secretary Rice, what do you think about our approach to China at this point? There is a more bipartisan consensus that we need to be tougher on China. That's one thing that actually did occur during the Trump era, and I think President Biden has more or less continued that. He hasn't lifted the tariffs. Secretary Esper just said we should abandon the one China policy. I mean, what should we be doing with China in that regard?
Well, I do think it's a time to tread rather carefully, actually, because, first of all, as Tom says, a lot is going to happen before this party Congress. Once the party Congress is over, I think we'll have both a better sense of how strong Xi Jinping really is. It's funny, these regimes are bulletproof until they're not. Right? And so watching what's going on in China. Secondly, while I am as much a China hawk as anybody these days, I think we have to try to keep some sense of balance in our approach. And by that I mean do everything that we need to do in terms of making sure that the Chinese are paying a price for IP theft, that we are not enriching Chinese companies that then enrich the PLA. I'm for all of that. But I'll give you an example of where I think we would make a huge mistake. I sit at Stanford University. We have lots of Chinese students. There's a narrative out there that because Chinese students are Chinese, we have to be careful about having them in our labs and having them with access to AI. And I would say 3 things about that, and this is the balance point. Let's not make this into the Soviet Union 2.0. Let's remember that this was a China that was on an integrationist path, still has actually a lot at stake in what happens to the international economy. And let's see if we can play off of some of that to relieve some of the tension. So I always say about the students, there are 3 problems with the argument that the first is, you know, if you were going to stop this, you probably needed to shut this door 10 years ago because it underestimates indigenous Chinese development to just say they're just stealing. They're not just stealing anymore. Secondly, I would say, you know, so the graduate student who, quote, takes home secrets, do you know how open scientific inquiry is? You can simply pick up a scientific magazine and know what's going on in a lab. So let's not get overly. And finally, and I said this to FBI Director Wray, I said, you know, if you're worried about somebody as an agent of the PLA, don't give them a visa and we won't admit them. But don't turn universities into intelligence agencies because we won't do it very well and it will be against our values and you will kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So I think we do have to have some balance in it. Where it comes to Taiwan, and I'm a great fan of Mark Esper's and this, you know, I'm probably not quite ready to jettison the one China policy. It's actually served us pretty well. I've often thought that what the United States is doing is trying to make sure that you don't get on either side destabilizing steps. So when we were in office, Chen Shui-bian was going to put out a referendum on independence. And we backed him off that. But now China is the problem. And so we have to do what we need to do to rebalance it, but I think it's a little early to jettison the one China policy.
So Tom, in the interest of balance, then is it a good idea for Speaker Pelosi to go, or is that too provocative at this point?
Well, I think we have to do an analysis of it, right? I mean, as Condi said, you know, the superstructure that's been in place for 50 years has served us well. It's served all 3 parties well. It's especially served Taiwan well. It's become a vibrant economy, a vibrant democracy. Second, you know, our policy has been pretty consistent across the 50 years, which is that to enhance and secure stability and prevent conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and to push back against any unilateral steps to change that balance. And I think that should continue to be what informs decisions on Taiwan. You know, we've got dual mandates in the Taiwan Relations Act. We don't talk about the second. You know, the first is to provide for the legitimate defense needs of Taiwan. But the second, and doesn't get talked about enough, is also to ensure that we, the United States, has the capacity to act if, in fact, China undertook an effort to, by force, change the situation in the Strait. So I guess the bottom line, Peter, is I think you'd have to kind of take that all into account, right? And do an analysis, a risk analysis, as to whether it serves the policy or not.
That was an interesting duck. Steve, you have a view on that?
I'm going to straddle the middle. First, look, one of the things that President Bush said was in his Taiwan policy was no unilateral change in the status quo by either side. And if you talk to the Chinese, they say, you Americans have unilaterally changed the status quo, and quite frankly, there are things that we have done that they can point to that would justify that. We would say, quite rightly, and there's a lot we can point to, that China has unilaterally changed the status quo. If you straight line these out, we're headed for a confrontation. So one question that the administration has to turn around is, do you start a conversation with China? What are you doing? What are we doing that bothers you? What are you doing that bothers us with respect to Taiwan? And can we agree to back it down? I think that may be worth doing. But I will tell you, my real worry is that Xi Jinping is committed to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. That is the basis of the legitimacy of this Communist Party with their people. He's lost the double-digit growth, which was the basis of his legitimacy with the Chinese people. He's converting to a new one, which is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And that includes, in his view, bringing Taiwan under China. If he is wedded to that, and if he is wedded to doing that while he is in office, And if he becomes convinced that unification really isn't going to happen peacefully, I worry that he does a Putin and rolls the dice and really puts a lot more pressure on Taiwan, not across Straits invasion, but a lot of other things he can do through cyber and the rest to undermine Taiwan, destroy its economy, destabilize its currency, destabilize its markets to try to bring it to his knees to make a deal on his terms. I worry about that. So I think, yes, do efforts to try to back down the current confrontation, but we need to be prepared and planning if that does not work.
We talk about talking with autocrats. I just got back from President Biden's trip to the Middle East, where, of course, as you know, he fist bumped with MBS after having promised to make him a pariah. I'm curious, as former national security advisors, is that a trip you would have advised your president to make if he had taken the position Joe Biden had taken?
Well, I think the problem was the first position, because who isn't going to go to Saudi Arabia? I mean, name an American president who's not going to go to Saudi Arabia at some point. So don't say that you're not going to go to Saudi Arabia. You're going to go to Saudi Arabia. It's because of economic reasons and because of stability in the Middle East. And in fact, you know, we have to talk about our values. I hope he did bring up Khashoggi. I hope he did bring up the human rights issues. But it is a Middle East that is evolving in ways that are pretty dramatically optimistic. And I never used the word optimistic and Middle East in the same sentence when I was secretary. But think about it. Think about Israel and the Gulf states and what is developing there. Think about the fact that you could actually be at a place where the Arabs end the state of war against Israel, really end it. And why? Not because they've learned to love the Jewish democratic state of Israel, but because the smarter of them have realized that in order to modernize their own economies and not be completely dependent on oil, that they're going to have to deal with the 800-pound gorilla on technology in the region, and that's Israel. And so the dynamics in the Middle East are such that I think an American president going there and promoting and encouraging those dynamics is a very good thing. It's also important because I think it's probably well known to an audience like this. Look, we had some problems with, for instance, the UAE and others. They didn't feel that we were there for them when the attacks took place on November 17th. And so there was some repair work to be done as well. So I think it was a good thing to go to the Middle East. Never say you're never going to do something because you end up doing it. And I'm still not sure whether a fist pump is more intimate than a handshake.
Yeah, I didn't understand that either. Yeah. Anybody disagree with that?
No, I think it was absolutely the right decision to take. But I think Condi's right. Obviously, there are opportunities for the United States in the region. There was work to do on some of the key relationships that had to get done. It is an important region for the global economy. We are, as we talked at the outset of this discussion, working as hard. We need to work very hard on the so-called swing states, right? And the Gulf falls into that category. There is competition with China and Russia in the Middle East, and we also have a serious security issue in the Middle East, which I think is actually the biggest problem we have in the Middle East, which is the Iran situation.
Let's talk about that, because your administration obviously did seal the Iran nuclear deal. Steve and Condi's administration at least tried. You did have talks with Iran toward the end, I think, that were more fruitful than people remember. Is a deal today possible given everything that's happened, or is it a flight of fancy to think that we can do that? Steve, you want?
I'm skeptical that there will be a deal. I'm skeptical that even if there is a deal, it will ultimately keep Iran from having a nuclear weapon. I'm pretty pessimistic about it, and I think we need to start thinking about what the policy is if we in the region are going to have to deal with a nuclear Iran.
What should the policy be if we can't get the deal then?
I think we've got to do a number of things to ensure that Iran does not proliferate that technology. I think we need to do a lot of things to ensure ourselves and our regional allies' ability to protect and defend against any kind of effort by Iran to use that capability. And we need to have the kind of presence that would deter Iran from even trying.
So President Biden said to Israeli TV before going that he would use force as a last resort. I don't think he said it quite as openly as that before, although that's been the implication for many administrations. Is that where we're heading?
I think so. I think that basically, again, the United States needs to undertake every step it can to deter Iran from going the final steps, acquiring a nuclear weapon or a nuclear weapon capability. I think we also need to be working with Israel to ensure that Israel has the capability to deal with an Iran that's proceeding towards a nuclear capability, and we need to be prepared to act. I think,
Well,
which is why this is a very dangerous situation.
This is a great way to end it in some ways because we're about to hear from their successor who actually has to make all these decisions. It's great to be up here and not have to make them, right?
Is.
But now it's Jake Sullivan to tell us what's really going to happen and to answer all these really hard questions and save the world. So thank you guys very much for taking your time and sharing your wisdom with us today. That's good, though. It's all right.